Come out of this little wind jacket because they're so loud. See? All right, so we are on with A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, Chapter 7. Chapter 7, Merlin's Tower. Inasmuch as I was now the second personage in the kingdom as far as political power and authority were concerned, much was made of me. My raiment was of silks and velvets and cloth of gold, and by consequence was very showy, also uncomfortable. But habit would soon reconcile me to my clothes. I was aware of that. I was given the choicest suite of apartments in the castle after the king's. They were aglow with loud-colored silken hangings, but the stone floors had nothing but rushes on them for a carpet, and they were misfit rushes at that, being not all of one breed. As for conveniences, properly speaking, there weren't any. I mean little conveniences. It is the little conveniences that make the real comfort of life. The big oaken chairs, graced with rude carvings, were well enough, but that was the stopping place. There was no soap, no matches, no looking-glass, except a metal one about as powerful as a pail of water, and not a chromo. I'd been used to chromos for years, and I saw now that without my suspecting it, a passion for the art had got worked into the fabric of my being and was become a part of me. It made me homesick to look around over this proud and gaudy but heartless barrenness, and remember that in our house in East Hartford, all unpretending as it was, you couldn't go into a room but you would find an insurance chromo, or at least a three-color God Bless Our Home over the door, and in the parlor we had 9. But here, even in my grand room of state, there wasn't anything in the nature of a picture, except a thing the size of a bedquilt, which was neither woven nor knitted. It had been darned in places. It had darned places in it, and nothing in it was the right color or the right shape. And as for proportions, even Raphael himself couldn't have botched them more formidably, after all his practice on the nightmares they call his celebrated Hampton Court cartoons. Raphael was a bird. We had several of his chromos. One was his miraculous draft of fishes, where he puts in a miracle of his own, puts 3 men in a canoe which wouldn't have held a dog without upsetting. I always admired to study Raphael's art. It was so fresh and unconventional. So if you're on TikTok, I am I'm recording on my audiobook, Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. SJ, welcome. You can do it here, and also check out my YouTube channel. I do a lot of poetry readings as well, so I have like a poem, like a sleep podcast. Yeah, Laura, this is a great book. It's a lot of fun to read. Twain was just a funny guy. There's a lot of, tongue-in-cheek social commentary and whatnot. A lot of fun. Excuse me. Okay, let's see. There wasn't even a bell or a speaking tube in the castle. I had a great many servants, and those that were on duty lolled in the anteroom. And when I wanted one of them, I had to go out and call for him. There was no gas, there was no candles. A bronze dish half full of Borden-house butter with a blazing rag floating in it was the thing that produced what was regarded as light. A lot of these hung along the walls and modified the dark, just toned it down enough to make it dismal. If you went out at night, your servants carried torches. There were no books, pens, paper, or ink, and no glass in the openings they believed to be windows. It was a little thing, glass is, until it's absent. Then it becomes a big thing. But perhaps the worst of all was that there wasn't any sugar, coffee, tea, or tobacco. and I saw that I was just another Robinson Crusoe cast away on an uninhabited island, with no society but some more or less tame animals, and if I wanted to make life bearable, I must do as he did: invent, contrive, create, recognize, reorganize things, set brain and hand to work, and keep them busy. Well, that was in my line. One thing troubled me along at first: the immense interest which people took in me. Apparently, the whole nation wanted to look at me. It soon transpired that the eclipse had scared the British world almost to death. That while it lasted the whole country from one end to the other was a pitiable state of panic, and the churches, hermitages, and monkeries overflowed with praying and weeping poor creatures who thought the end of the world was come. Then had followed the news that the producer of this awful event was a stranger, a mighty magician at Arthur's court, that he could have blown out the sun like a candle, and was just going to do it when his mercy was purchased, and he then dissolved his enchantments and was now reorganized and honored as the man who had by his unaided might saved the globe from destruction and its peoples from extinction. Now, if you consider that everybody believed that, and not only believed it, but never even dreamed of doubting it, you will easily understand that there was not a person in all Britain that would have not walked 50 miles to get a sight of me. Anna, what's going on? How you doing? Of course, I was all the talk. Of course, I was all the talk. All other subjects were dropped. Even the king became suddenly a person of minor interest and notoriety. Within 24 hours, the delegations began to arrive, and from that time onward, for a fortnight, they kept coming. The village was crowded, and all the countryside. I had to go out a dozen times a day and show myself to these reverent and awe-stricken multitudes. It came to be a great burden as to time and trouble, but of course, it was at the same time compensatingly agreeable to be so celebrated, and such a center of homage. It turned Brer Merlin green with envy and spite, which was a great satisfaction to me. But there was one thing I couldn't understand. Nobody had asked for an autograph. I spoke to Clarence about it. By George, I had to explain to him what it was. Then he said nobody in the country could read or write but a few dozen priests. Land, think of that. There was another thing that troubled me a little. Those multitudes presently began to agitate for another miracle. It was natural to be able to carry back to their far homes the boast that they had seen the man who could command the sun riding in the heavens and be obeyed, would make them great in the eyes of their neighbors and envied by them all. But to be able also to say that they had seen him work a miracle themselves, why, people would come a distance to see that. People would come a distance to see them. The pressure got to be pretty strong. There was going to be an eclipse of the moon, and I knew the date and hour, but it was too far away. 2 years. I would have given a good deal for a license to hurry it up and use it now when there was a big market for it. It seemed a great pity to have wasted so and come lagging along at a time when a body wouldn't have any use for it, as like as not. If it had been booked for only a month away, I could have sold it short. But as matters stood, I couldn't seem to cipher out any way to make me do any good, so I gave up trying. Next, Clarence found that old Merlin was making himself busy on the sly among those people. He was spreading a report that I was a humbug, and that the reason I didn't accommodate the people with a miracle was because I couldn't. I saw that I must do something. I presently thought out a plan. By my authority as executive, I threw Merlin into prison, the same cell I had occupied myself. Then I gave public notice by herald and trumpet that I should be busy with affairs of state for a fortnight, And about the end of that time, I would take a moment's leisure and blow up Merlin's stone tower by fires from heaven. In the meantime, whoso listened to evil reports about me, let him beware. Furthermore, I would perform but this one miracle at this time, and no more. If it failed to satisfy, and any murmured, I would turn the murmurers into horses and make them useful. Quiet ensued. This is Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. What a hoot. Oh, Mark, what a hoot. Jay, what's going on? Hello, Harriet. Good to see you in here. Let's see, where was I at? I took Clarence into my confidence to a certain degree, and we went to work privately. I told him that this was a sort of miracle that required a trifle of preparation, and that it would be sudden death to ever talk about these preparations to anybody. That made his mouth safe enough. Clandestinely, we made a few bushels of first-rate blasting powder, and I superintended my armorers while they constructed a lightning rod and some wires. This old stone tower was very massive, and rather ruinous too, for it was Roman and 400 years old. Yes, and handsome, after a rude fashion, and clothed with ivy from base to summit, as with a shirt of scale mail. It stood on a lonely eminence, in good view from the castle and about a half-mile away. Working by night, we stowed the powder in the tower, dug stones out on the inside, and buried the powder in the walls themselves, which were 15 feet thick at the base. We put in a peck at a time in a dozen places. We could have blown up the Tower of London with these charges. When the 13th night was come, we put up our lightning rod, bedded it in one of the batches of powder, and ran wires from it to the other batches. Everybody had shunned that locality from the day of my proclamation, but on the morning of the 14th, I thought best to warn the people, through the heralds, to keep clear away, a quarter of a mile away. Then added by command that at some time during the 24 hours I would consummate the miracle, but would first give a brief notice, by flags on the castle towers, if in the daytime, by torch baskets in the same place, if at night. Thunder showers had been tolerably frequent of late, and I was not much afraid of failure. Still, I shouldn't have cared for a delay of a day or two. I should have explained that I was busy with affairs of state yet, and the people must wait. Of course, we had a blazing sunny day, almost the first one without a cloud for 3 weeks. Things always happen so. I kept secluded and watched the weather. Clarence dropped in from time to time and said the public excitement was growing and growing all the time, and the whole country filling up with human masses as far as one could see from the battlements. At last, the wind sprang up and a cloud appeared, in the right quarter, too, and just at nightfall. For a little while I watched the distant clouds spread and blacken. Then I judged it was time for me to appear. I ordered the torch baskets to be lit and Merlin liberated and sent to me. A quarter of an hour later, I ascended the parapet, and there found the king and the court assembled and gazing off in the darkness toward Merlin's tower. Already the darkness was so heavy that one could not see far. These people and the old turrets, being partly in deep shadow and partly in the red glow from the great torch baskets overhead, made a good deal of a picture. Merlin arrived in a gloomy mood. I said, "You wanted to burn me alive when I had not yet done you any harm, and latterly, you've been trying to injure my professional reputation. Therefore, I'm going to call down fire and blow up your tower. But it's only fair to give you a chance. Now, if you think you can break my enchantments and ward off the fires, step to the bat. It's your innings." "I can, fair sir, and I will. Doubt it not." He drew an imaginary circle on the stones of the roof and burnt a pinch of powder in it, which sent up a small cloud of aromatic smoke, whereat everybody fell back and began to cross themselves and get uncomfortable. Then he began to mutter and make passes in the air with his hands. He worked himself up slowly and gradually into a sort of frenzy and got to thrashing around with his arms like the sails of a windmill. By this time, the storm had about reached us. The gusts of wind were flaring the torches. The gusts of wind were flaring the torches and making the shadows swash about. The first heavy drops of rain were falling. The world abroad was black as pitch. The lightning began to wink fitfully. Of course, my rod would be loading itself now. In fact, things were imminent, so I said, "You've had time enough. I have given you every advantage and not interfered. It's plain your magic is weak. It's only fair that I begin now." I made about 3 passes in the air, and then there was an awful crash, and that old tower leaped into the sky in chunks, along with a vast volcanic fountain of fire that turned night to noonday and showed 1,000 acres of humans groveling on the ground and being in a general collapse of consternation. Well, it rained mortar and masonry the next week. It rained mortar and masonry the rest of the week. This was the report, but probably the facts would have modified it. It was an effective miracle. The great bothersome temporary population vanished. There were a good many thousand tracks in the mud the next morning, but they were all outward bound. If I had advertised another miracle, I couldn't have even raised an audience with the sheriff. Merlin's stock was flat. The king wanted to stop his wages. He even wanted to banish him, but I interfered. I said he would be useful to work the weather and attend to small matters like that, and I would give him a lift now and then with his poor little parlor magic. And I would give him a lift every now and then when his poor little parlor magic soured on him. There wasn't a rag of his tower left, but I had the government rebuild it for him and advised him to take boarders. But he was too high-toned for all that. And as for being grateful, he never even said thank you. He was rather a hard lot. Take him how you might. But then you couldn't fairly expect a man to be sweet that had been back. But then you couldn't fairly expect a man to be sweet that had been set back so. That was chapter 7 of Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, Merlin's Tower. Excuse me. I don't know if I must do the next one. I want to see how long it is. Okay, we'll do one more chapter. The weather has just started to get this a little cooler this week, so I'm not like roasting. I'm not slow roasting in this place, which is nice. My camera's not overheating. I'm not overheating. It's a good time. Okay. What's cool? To here where I am, I mean, I would say anything under 80 Fahrenheit would be considered cool. But it also depends on the humidity. Sometimes it'll be, 78, 79, but the humidity is really high, so you're still sweating. So, it's so relative. Temperature's so relative. All right, let's do, we'll work on Chapter 8, The Boss. To be vested with enormous authority is a fine thing, but to have the onlooking world consent to it is a finer. The Tower episode solidified my power and made it impregnable. If any were perchance disposed to be jealous and critical before that, they experienced a change of heart now. There was not anyone in the kingdom who would have considered it good judgment to meddle with my matters. I was getting adjusted to my situation and circumstances. For a time, I used to wake up mornings and smile at my dream and listen for the Colt's factory whistle. But that sort of thing played out itself gradually, and at last I was fully able to realize that I was actually living in the 6th century and in Arthur's court, not a lunatic asylum. After that, I was just as much at home in that century as I could have been in any other. And as for preference, I wouldn't have traded it for the 20th. Look at the opportunities here for a man of knowledge, brains, pluck, and enterprise to sail in and grow up with the country. The grandest field that ever was, and all my own, not a competitor, not a man who wasn't a baby to me in acquaintance and not a man who wasn't a baby to me in, not a man who wasn't a baby to me in acquirements and capacities. Whereas what I would amount to in the 20th century, I should be a foreman of a factory, that's about all, and could drag a seine down a street any day and catch 100 better men than myself. What a jump I'd made. I couldn't keep from thinking about it and contemplating it, just as one who has struck oil. There was nothing back of me that could approach it, unless it might be Joseph's case, and Joseph only approached it. It didn't equal it quite. It only stands to reason that as Joseph's splendid financial ingenuities advantaged nobody but the king, the general public must have regarded him with a good deal of disfavor, whereas I had done my entire public a kindness in sparing the son, and was popular by reason of it. I was no shadow of a king. I was the substance. The king himself was the shadow. My power was colossal. And it was not a mere name, as such things have generally been. It was the genuine article. I stood here at the very spring and source of the second great period of the world's history, and could see the trickling stream of that history gather and deepen and broaden and roll its mighty tides down the far centuries. And I could note the upspringing of adventurers like myself in the shelter of its long array of thrones, de Montforts, Gavestons, Mortimers, Villierses, the war-making, campaign-directing wantons of France, and Charles II's scepter-wielding drabs, and nowhere in the procession was my full-sized fellow visible. I was a unique, and glad to know that that fact could not be dislodged or challenged for 13 centuries and a half for sure. Yes, in power I was equal to the king. At the same time, there was another power that was a trifle stronger than both of us put together. That was the church. I do not wish to disguise that fact. I couldn't if I wanted to, but never mind about that now. It will show up in its proper place later on. It didn't cause me any trouble in the beginning, or at least of consequence. Well, it was a curious country and full of interest. And the people, they were the quaintest and simplest and trustingest race. Why, they were nothing but rabbits. It was pitiful for a person born in a wholesome, free atmosphere to listen to their humble and hearty outpourings of loyalty toward their king and church and nobility, as if they had any more reason to love and honor king and church and noble than a slave has to love and honor the lash, or a dog has to love and honor the stranger that kicks him. Why, dear me, any kind of royalty, howsoever modified, any kind of aristocracy, howsoever pruned, is rightly an insult. But if you're born and brought up under that sort of arrangement, you probably never find it out for yourself. And don't believe it when somebody else tells you. It's enough to make a body ashamed of his race to think of that sort of froth that has always occupied its thrones without shadow of right or reason, and the seventh-rate people that have always figured as its aristocracies, a company of monarchs and nobles who, as a rule, would have achieved only poverty and obscurity if left, like their betters, to their own exertions. The most of King Arthur's British nation were slaves, pure and simple, and bore that name, and wore the iron collar on their necks. And the rest were slaves in fact, but without the name. They imagined themselves free and free men, and called themselves so. The truth was, the nation as a body was in the world for one object and one object only: to grovel before king and church and noble, to slave for them, sweat blood for them, starve that they might be fed, work that they might play, drink misery to the dregs that they might be happy, go naked that they might wear silks and jewels, pay taxes that they might be spared from paying them, be familiar all their lives with the degrading language and postures of adulation, that they might walk in pride and think themselves the god of this world. And for all this, the thanks they got were cuffs and contempt. And so poor-spirited were they that they took even this sort of attention as an honor. Inherited ideas are a curious thing, and interesting to observe and examine. I had mine. The king and his people had theirs. In both cases, they flowed in ruts worn deep by time and habit, and the man who should have proposed to divert them by reason and argument would have had a long contract on his hands. For instance, those people who had inherited the idea that all men without title and a long degree, whether they had great natural gifts and acquirements or hadn't, were creatures of no more consideration than so many animals, bugs, insects. Whereas I had inherited the idea that human daws who can consent to masquerade in the peacock shams of inherited dignities and unearned titles are of no good but to be laughed at. The way I was looked upon was odd, but it was natural. You know how the keeper and the public regard the elephant in the menagerie? Well, that's the idea. They are full of admiration of his vast bulk and his prodigious strength. They can speak with pride of the fact that he can do 100 marvels which are far and away beyond their own powers, and they speak with the same pride of the fact that in his wrath he is able to drive 1,000 men before him. But does that make him one of them? No. The raggedest tramp in the pit would smile at the idea. He couldn't comprehend it, couldn't take it in, couldn't in any remote way conceive of it. Well, to the king, the nobles, and all the nation, down to the very slaves and tramps, I was just that kind of an elephant and nothing more. I was admired, also feared, but it was as an animal is admired and feared. The animal is not reverenced, neither was I. I was not even respected. I had no pedigree, no inherited title. So in the king's and nobles' eyes, I was mere dirt. The people regarded me with wonder and awe, but there was no reverence mixed with it. Through the force of inherited ideas, they were not able to conceive of anything being entitled to that except degree. They were not able to conceive of anything being entitled to that except pedigree and lordship. There you see the hand of that awful power, the Roman Catholic Church. In 2 or 3 little centuries, it had converted a nation of men to a nation of worms. Before the day of the Church's supremacy in the world, men were men and held their heads up and had a man's pride and spirit and independence. And what of greatness and position a person got, he got mainly by achievement, not by birth. But then the Church came to the front with an axe to grind. And she was so wise, subtle, and knew more than one way to skin a cat or a nation. She invented divine right of kings and propped it all around brick by brick with the Beatitudes, wrenching them from their good purpose to make them fortify an evil one. She preached to the commoner humility, obedience to superiors, the beauty of self-sacrifice. She preached to the commoner meekness under insult, preached still to the commoner, always to the commoner, patience, meanness of spirit, non-resistance under oppression, and she introduced heritable ranks and aristocracies and taught all the Christian populations of the earth to bow down to them and worship them. Even down to my birth century, that poison was still in the blood of Christendom. The best of English commoners was still content to see his inferiors imprudently continuing to hold a number of positions, such as lordships and the throne, to which the grotesque laws of his country did not allow him to aspire. In fact, he was not merely contented with this strange condition of things, he was even able to persuade himself that he was proud of it. It seems to show that there isn't anything you can't stand, if you're only born and bred to it. Of course, that taint, but reverence for rank and title had been in our American blood, too. I know that. But when I left America, it had disappeared, at least to all intents and purposes. The remnant of it was restricted to the dudes and dudesses. When a disease has worked its way down to that level, it may be fairly said to be out of the system. But to return to my position in King Arthur's kingdom. Here I was, a giant among pygmies, a man among children, a master intelligence among intellectual moles. All rational measurement, the one and only actually great man. By all rational measurement, the one and only actually great man in that whole British world. And yet there and then, just as in the remote England of my birth-time, the sheep-witted earl, who could claim long descent from a king's layman, acquired at second hand from the slums of London, was better than I was. Such a personage was fawned upon in Arthur's realm and reverently looked upon by everybody, even though his dispositions were as mean as his intelligence, and his morals as base as his lineage. There were times when he could sit down in the king's presence, but I couldn't. I could have got a title easily enough, but that would have raised me a large step in everybody's eyes, even in the king's, the giver of it. But I didn't ask for it, and I declined it when it was offered. I couldn't have enjoyed such a thing with my notion, and it couldn't have been fair anyway, because as far back as I could go, our tribe had always been short of the bar sinister. I couldn't have felt really and satisfactorily fine and proud and set up over any title except one that should come from the nation itself, the only legitimate source. And such an one I hoped to win, and in the course of years of honest and honorable endeavor, I did win it, and did wear it with a high and clean pride. This title fell casually from the lips of a blacksmith one day in a village was caught up as a happy thought and tossed from mouth to mouth with a laugh and an affirmative vote. In 10 days it had swept the kingdom, and it was as familiar as the king's name. I was never known by any other designation afterward, whether in the nation's talk or in grave debate upon matters of state at the council board of the sovereign. This title, translated into modern speech, would be the boss, elected by the nation. That suited me. And it was a pretty big title. There were very few thes, and I was one of them. If you spoke of the duke or the earl or the bishop, how could anybody tell what you meant? But if you spoke of the king or the queen or the boss, it was different. Well, I liked the king, and as king I respected him, respected the office, at least respected it as much as I was capable of respecting any unearned supremacy. But as men, I looked down upon him and his nobles privately. And he and they liked me and respected my office. But as an animal, without birth or sham title, they looked down upon me and were not particularly private about it either. I didn't charge for my opinion about them, and they didn't charge for their opinion about me. The account was square, the books balanced, everybody was satisfied. Alrighty, well, that was Chapter 7 and Chapter 8 of A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. And you can check the rest of them out on my YouTube channel if you like, and along with a lot of other stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.